Good afternoon to everybody down in Manhattan. It's a miserable day up here about 13 miles away from where you are, but we're here together and that's all that matters. And we're going to go back in time to 1961 and John Kennedy. But I've been doing these talks for various people, seniors particularly, around the country lately, thanks to Zoom. And we have had these discussions afterwards where people say we haven't solved the problems of 1961. It's 60 years later. What's going on? Well, let's go back to 1961 and talk about John Kennedy, who was elected president in November of 1960. And one of the great things about this picture you might see, hopefully you could see, is people are wearing top hats here. It was a top hat. The last time I've seen a picture with all kinds of top hats at John F. Kennedy's inauguration. And also there, Dwight Eisenhower, the outgoing president, the new vice president, Lyndon Johnson, next to Richard Nixon, the outgoing vice president. And Kennedy had called, or somebody marketed his presidency as the new frontier. And was it the new frontier? Probably not. Kennedy was a World War II veteran and a Cold Warrior. He was very into the Cold War between the US and the USSR. And so it probably was nothing more than a marketing scheme. There was a threat, you might remember, 90 miles from the United States that has not gone away. It's called Cuba. And here's a picture of Havana back in 1961. Civil rights movement, there is Martin Luther King. That's accelerating. 1960 saw sit-ins and more demonstrations. There would be more demonstrations in 1961. Adolf Eichmann was tried for war crimes in Israel. He was picked up in 1960, finally hanged in 1962. Vietnam was getting more and more prominent attention in the Kennedy administration. And Kennedy at one of his news conferences talking about the communist rebel areas in North Vietnam back in December of 1960. And the Cold War, that is the beginning of the Berlin Wall being built to separate East Berlin and West Berlin in East Germany back in 1961. And that wall would be up for more than a quarter of a century. And this guy here, his name is Newton Minow. He is still alive. He lives up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He's about 96 years old now. He was the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission under John F. Kennedy, and he talked about television as a vast wasteland. It's goodbye, Dwight Eisenhower, and hello to John F. Kennedy as President of the United States. But Dwight Eisenhower still had some business he wanted to finish in January of 1961 in his final days as president, but he has 20 days in 1961 and he makes a very critical decision. On January 3rd, 1961, the United States breaks off diplomatic relations with Cuba. Possibly you might have gone to Cuba in the 1950s because that was a haven for American tourists, and also if you wanted to gamble, that's where you went. In 1956, Fidel Castro, who used to come up to New York regularly in the 1950s, and his associates tried a guerrilla warfare as a way of toppling the Batista government. Batista was a dictator, but he was America's dictator in Cuba because he was anti-communist. By 1959, Castro and his associates brought down Batista. Castro would turn to the Soviet Union for aid. The Cold War was now 90 miles away from the United States in Florida, and Castro is getting closer and closer to the Soviet Union, the United States' Cold War enemy. But John Kennedy has an interesting route to become the president of the United States. Not only does he have to beat Richard Nixon, he has to fend off an electoral college challenge after he does beat Nixon and Nixon decides, okay, I'm not going to contest that. And it's funny how history always repeats itself because some of this from 1960 echoed in 2020, 2021 with the last presidential election. The 1960 presidential race was highly contested. John Kennedy won by a very narrow margin. Richard Nixon would concede, but there was a group of politicians not very happy with all this, and they decided they're going to contest the race. The group was made up of mostly white conservative men, electors from the South, in fact, they were all men, who opposed JFK's quote-unquote liberal policies, especially his support for civil rights for Black Americans. The Republicans claimed there was voter fraud in 11 states, filed suit in 2 of them, Texas and Illinois. Kennedy won Illinois by about 9,000 votes, and there were some suggestions that those votes weren't all legit that he won by. The suit in Illinois charged that the Democratic stronghold of Chicago, Cook County, Mayor Richard Daley had dug up Kennedy voters from the cemeteries of Chicago. But over the years, I found out that Nixon apparently had South Illinois all wired with votes as well, and never contested it. The judge threw out both lawsuits. Nixon took no part in the voting challenges, saying that our country cannot afford the agony of a constitutional crisis. So what's the next step here? Well, topple John F. Kennedy if possible. Don't allow him to become the president. Topple him and come up with some plans. And these people in the South did come up with some plans. They went after the Electoral College. Electors from Alabama and Mississippi did not cast their votes for Kennedy, who had won both states. Mississippi's 8 electors and 6 of Alabama's 11 electors said, we're faithless. We're not going to pledge our support for Kennedy. They would ask their counterparts around the United States to help them with this plan to overthrow the election. Well, that didn't really go too far, but it was plan A, and electors from 11 states decided, hey, maybe we could use our clout to ask Kennedy, don't send U.S. aid to communist countries, and support states' rights, which they were more interested in the aid to the communist countries. And that was a code for resisting racial integration. So if Kennedy refuses that, there would be a plan B. The resolution would call for the position of the candidates in the election, the winning side, to be reversed. That would mean that Lyndon Johnson would be the president-elect from Texas, and Kennedy would be the vice president. But that doesn't fly either. So they come up with yet a third plan. Have Harry Byrd become the president of the United States. But this was going to be very, very complicated. So they lose the court suits. Nixon decides not to contest. Plan A doesn't fly. Plan B doesn't fly. Let's try this. Plan C, President Harry Byrd. Republican electors from all 50 states would meet in Chicago and pick a president from a list of outstanding Southern men, Democrats for the most part. Among the choices, the Virginia Senator Harry Byrd, the segregationist governors Orville Farbus of Arkansas and Russ Barnett of Mississippi, and the Georgia Senator Richard Russell. Those were the outstanding Southern men, but that didn't go anywhere. Eventually, the Electoral College would vote, and the unpledged electors from Mississippi, 8 of them, 6 from Alabama, and 1 from Oklahoma cast their votes for Harry Byrd, the Virginia senator, instead of Kennedy. Byrd would receive 15 electoral votes for president in the 1960 election. So the next strategy is, well, if we can't topple JFK, let's put it into people's mind that Kennedy was an illegitimate president. He's illegitimate. Let's put it into people's mind. Cast some doubt. Create a perception that somehow the JFK wasn't the legitimate president. At the end of the day, the results stood. John Kennedy, the Democrat, got 303 Electoral College votes, or 34,227,096 votes. Richard Nixon, the Republican, 219 Electoral College votes. Very close. He loses by 120,000 votes. 34,107,646. So it was less than 120,000 votes. And then there's Harry Byrd, who only got 116,248 votes, but he got 15 Electoral College votes. Kennedy does become the president, and really there was no perception that JFK had some sort of an illegitimate presidency, except in some people's minds. The civil rights movement is first and foremost on Kennedy's mind, and you may not recognize this woman, Charlene Hutt, but you will now, rather Charlene Hunter, at the University of Georgia. She's 18 years old, and she's supposed to start classes at school under a federal order. But she doesn't on January 12th, because the night before, Charlene Hunter says for her own protection, she's leaving. Students staged an uprising against the integration. But she kind of did rather well for herself, because some of you might have watched her on Channel 13, on the NewsHour, or some other show on Channel 13. She became Dr. Charlene Hunter Galt, a journalist, among other things in her life, and still a civil rights advocate, even though she did not go to the University of Georgia January 12th, 1961, but she did rather well for herself. Dwight Eisenhower says goodbye on January 17th, 1961. It is his final time of addressing the nation as the President of the United States, and he issues a warning about the military-industrial complex, which still resonates to this day, 60 years later. People talk about the Eisenhower final talk to the American people, and he warns against, or warns the nation about how the military and the industrial complex have increasing powers, and that's not a good thing. He says, as we peer into society's future, we, you and I, in our government, must avoid the impulse to live only for today, plundering for our own ease and convenience. Excuse me here for a second. The precious resources of tomorrow. We cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren without asking the loss of their political and spiritual heritage. From the oldest president to the youngest elected president. Theodore Roosevelt was actually younger when he assumed the presidency following the assassination of William McKinley back in 1901. Dwight Eisenhower is 70 years old. John Kennedy is 43 years old. John Kennedy, born in the 20th century. Nixon was young too as well. He's also born in the 20th century, and he's the first of the 20th century babies to assume the presidency. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That's probably what is remembered from Kennedy's inaugural address. Wasn't exactly an original thought. One of the schools he went to growing up, the guy who was running the school said, ask not what your school could do for you, ask what your school you could do for your school. But there's Kennedy. Take a look at him. He's a young guy, full head of hair, young children. There's Caroline. There is John F. Kennedy Jr., John. There's a pony at the White House named Macaroni. And yeah, they're a very young family. It's a new life for America. They came out of the 1950s and into the 1960s, and it's going to be a new frontier for John F. Kennedy. Young, his wife is very young, and they are getting into the mood of the 60s. At the age of 43, Kennedy's the youngest man ever elected president of the United States. In his case, image is absolutely everything. He has thick hair. He wore cool sunglasses. Jackie Kennedy, well, she was only about 32 years old. She's the stylish wife who dresses really, really, really well. And they have a cute little family with 2 small children. And they played touch football on the White House lawn or up at the Kennedy compound up near Hyannisport. And he was a World War II hero. He saved his men after his patrol boat sunk, although there may be a lot more to the story as the years come out. And also he would have a movie done with Cliff Robertson about PT-109, which was the boat that Kennedy was leading that was sunk. Image is everything. Take a look at Jackie. Jackie has got the pillbox hat. She's got the outfit in blue, complete with the gloves. And look at John Kennedy smiling there. He's got a nice blue suit on with a blue tie, and every hair is in place. Image is everything. Perceived perception. He looks presidential. He really does. But here's JFK's world. This is 1961. Let's compare it to the world of 2021. The Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. Just today, Joe Biden, or was it yesterday, put sanctions on the Russians, a new form of the Cold War, put sanctions on the Russians for interfering in America's election in 2020. Seems like not much has changed in 60 years. Cuba is still there. Cuba is still there. Castro's gone, but the United States still is sanctioning Cuba, and it's still a problem. Civil rights movement continued in 1961. There's a civil rights movement going on today. Hasn't changed very much. Vietnam, well, that's gone. Vietnam is gone, but there are other hot spots in the world. And the space race that Kennedy desperately wants to win. And what's the winning prize? Getting Americans on the moon prior to the Soviets landing on the moon. And Kennedy ran on something called the missile gap in 1960 and was concerned that the United States was behind Soviet Union in missiles, behind in the space race, and he was not going to allow that to happen. Meanwhile, over in Israel, that's Adolf Eichmann, who's on trial for his role in killing 6 million Jews. In fact, he came up with one of the final solution of the Jewish question, final solutions to the Jewish question. On May 23rd, 1960, the Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion announced that the Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann was captured in Argentina and would stand trial in Israel. Eichmann was the Nazi SS officer who organized Hitler's final solution of the Jewish question. He was seized by Israeli agents in Argentina on May 11th, 1960, and smuggled to Israel 9 days later. On April 11th, his trial begins in Jerusalem. It would be the first trial to be on TV. He faced 15 charges: crimes against humanity, crimes against the Jewish people, war crimes. He claimed, "I was just following orders." But the judges disagreed. They found him guilty on all counts. December 15th, 1961, sentenced him to die. On May 31st, 1962, he's hanged near Tel Aviv, Israel. His body subsequently cremated, his ashes thrown into the sea. 3 of his 4 kids have not denounced Eichmann. Only one of his kids ever did so. Now, here is an operation that actually started with Dwight Eisenhower and ended up in utter failure on April 17th of 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion. And Eisenhower is trying to figure out, well, how do we get Cuba again? What do we do? What are we supposed to do? We got to get them back on the same page. They're only 90 miles away from Florida. What are we supposed to do? A brigade of around 1,500 CIA-trained Cuban exile soldiers stormed the beach in Cuba's Bay of Pigs. It was a secret mission to overthrow Fidel Castro and halt the spread of communism throughout the world. It failed spectacularly. The mission was set into motion 60 years ago today, April 15, 1961, with a series of airstrikes to take out Castro's defenses. The plan was not executed well. It was terrible, as a matter of fact, and missed Cuban planes. On April 16, 1961, John Kennedy makes this decision, which probably was a fatal decision. He canceled the second series of air raids, which was to provide cover for these people invading Cuba and trying to overthrow Fidel Castro. And there was Castro during the Bay of Pigs invasion back in 1961. There is no air support, so most of the April 17th invaders are taken prisoner. 90 of them are killed, and they're supposed to be the Allies. These people were put together by Dwight Eisenhower in 1960, but he never did anything with them other than training them. Kennedy sent them into Cuba. Castro would become entrenched. The ties with the Soviet Union would strengthen. The Cuban exiled invaders were released from Cuban prisons between 1962 and 1965. A deal was cut with the United States. Cuba would get $53 million worth of food and medicine in exchange for the prisoners. Castro would end all elections after the Bay of Pigs. Civil rights movement, the orange and black bus lines over there, civil rights movement, freedom's wheels are rolling. And the law of the land is our demand, end segregation. Well, John Kennedy said that he might do something with the civil rights movement. He supported Martin Luther King in 1960 after King was arrested in Atlanta, and his brother, John F. Kennedy's brother, who's now the Attorney General of the United States, was able to get King sprung from prison in October of 1960. The Freedom Riders, you might remember some of the Freedom Riders or just the name Freedom Riders. They rode interstate buses into the segregated United States South beginning in 1961 to challenge non-enforcement of the United States Supreme Court decisions, Morgan versus Virginia 1946, Boynton versus Virginia 1960, that segregated public buses were unconstitutional. Well, in the South, nobody paid attention to the Supreme Court's decision, and the federal government didn't do anything to enforce it. But the Freedom Riders would leave Washington, D.C. on May 4th, and 13 days later, they were supposed to be in New Orleans. They didn't get there, and this is why they didn't get there. As a bus in rural Alabama that was firebombed by white supremacists who didn't particularly like the fact that there was a civil rights movement going on in Alabama. It was May 14th, Mother's Day, and angry white people blocked a Greyhound bus carrying black and white passengers through rural Alabama. The attackers pelted the vehicles with rocks and bricks, slashed tires, smashed windows with pipes and axes, and lobbed a firebomb through a broken window. Smoke and flames filled the bus. The mob barricaded the door and yelled, "Burn them alive." Well, they didn't, but it was pretty nasty stuff. There was pretty nasty stuff going on down the South. This is Congressman John Lewis as a college student back in 1961. John Lewis arrested in one of the demonstrations. He was the head of SNCC, one of the 6 groups that would eventually march on Washington in 1963. He became a member of Congress, passed away last year. John Lewis was the last of the big 6. On May 24th, 1961, that's Martin Luther King in Atlanta, Georgia, and he's buying a bus ticket. Why is he buying a bus ticket? Well, hey, he should be able to ride an interstate bus, although he would have problems riding an interstate bus, but why shouldn't he be on an interstate bus? After all, the Supreme Court said that it was illegal. John Kennedy was very, very slow to react to the civil rights movement. He campaigned on, yeah, I'm going to do something. And in 1960, October 1960, he called Coretta Scott King, the wife of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, after King was imprisoned at a sit-in at the Rich department store in Atlanta on some trumped-up charges that he somehow violated some probation after leading a sit-in in Atlanta. Robert Kennedy made a call to get MLK out of jail the next day. The calls were unnoticed during the presidential campaign. In 1961, though, John Kennedy sat on his hands and did nothing about housing segregation. In November, Robert Kennedy's, the Attorney General, May 29th memo to end the segregation of interstate busing took effect. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, halfway around the world, American troops are getting there. More and more they are arriving in Vietnam. On January 19th, there's a meeting between Eisenhower and Kennedy, the last meeting between the two men before Eisenhower left Washington and Kennedy moved into the Oval Office. Strangely enough, Eisenhower didn't say, hey, Vietnam's going to be one of your major problems. He didn't say that at all. Eisenhower instead said, you know, next to Vietnam, the country Laos, there's a problem there. It's a really weak government. You got to take care of that problem first. And he said Laos was the key to Southeast Asia because Eisenhower felt that Laos was a weak country, the weak link, and would be the beginning of the loss of most of the Far East countries to communism if it fell. And here's the domino theory. Starts in 1950 or so, and it says that eventually communism would take over in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. China would drop the dominoes, and North Korea would be the first, and North Vietnam was the second, then came Laos, then came Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Burma, India, even Australia and New Zealand could fall to communism. Eisenhower in 1954 is watching the French pull out of Vietnam. They had their hands full both in Vietnam and in Africa and Algeria. And the loss of the Vietnam to communist control, he felt, would lead to communist victories in neighboring countries, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and in India, Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, Australia, and New Zealand. He said the possible consequences of the loss are just incalculable to the free world. In his final days as president, the Soviet premier Nikita Khrushchev pledges support for wars of national liberation, which are not only taking place in Vietnam, but also in Africa, where there were 17 new countries in 1960 and more coming down the line. North Vietnam's leader, Ho Chi Minh, is listening to what Khrushchev is saying. And John Kennedy is determined not to lose South Vietnam, absolutely determined he is not going to lose South Vietnam. In May of 1961, Kennedy sends 400 American Green Beret special advisors to South Vietnam to train South Vietnamese soldiers in the method of counterinsurgency in the fight against the Viet Cong guerrillas. The Viet Cong had just formed in 1960, in the winter of late fall, early winter 1960s, made up of soldiers from North Vietnam and people in South Vietnam who wanted no part of President Diem. On October 24th, 1961, on the 6th anniversary of the Republic of South Vietnam being formed, Kennedy sends a letter to President Diem, who's of South Vietnam, pledging the United States is determined to help Vietnam preserve its independence, South Vietnam. Kennedy would send additional military advisors along with American helicopter units to transport and direct South Vietnamese troops in the battle. Kennedy wants to prevent a communist takeover of entire Vietnam, both North and South, which is in accordance with the policy of our government, which was followed since 1954. Oh, and there's also one other problem that Kennedy inherits. It's called North Vietnam. There was never an end to the war between the United States, South Korea, and North Korea in 1953, just a truce, and every once in a while you would see things flare up. The demilitarized zone where Americans are fighting some Koreans who penetrated their area. The space race, man enters space. But it wasn't the man that John Kennedy wanted. It was the guy that Nikita Khrushchev wanted. His name was Yuri Gagarin, and he orbits the Earth at a reported 188 miles above the Earth. And there's Werner von Braun, who is running the United States space program, saying to keep up with the Soviets, USA must run like hell. The USA did put a chimp ham into space, but the country did not have a man in space when this happened back in April of 1961. The Soviets had beaten the Americans, getting the first satellite into space on October 4th, 1957. On October 12th, the Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. It was a 108-minute orbital flight in Vostok 1 spacecraft. The Mercury astronaut, the American Alan Shepard, would become the first American sort of in space, but not really. It's suborbital in less than a month from there. So the Soviets beat the Americans getting into space. And there is Leonid Brezhnev, who eventually would be the Soviet premier, along with Gagarin, congratulating him after the initial flight. But Shepard's flight would take place May 5th, 1961. And Shepard was cracking jokes as he was on the launch pad. One of the jokes that he said was he was sitting on a rocket filled of the lowest bidders. Because if you know anything about government, people bid on jobs and the local government is required to take the lowest bid. And Shepard is comforted knowing that every piece of equipment that was made on the Mercury spacecraft was that from the lowest bid. But he also had a problem. He needed to go to the bathroom. They wouldn't let him go to the bathroom. They said, it's a short flight, just stay there. And he said, hey, we have so many breaks in the countdown, let me down. They wouldn't let him down, so he had to improvise. But he did successfully do the 15-minute space trip, and there was John Kennedy at the White House, pinning a medal on him while some of the astronauts, John Glenn, Scott Cooper, Gus Grissom, Scott Carpenter, are watching along with Wernher von Braun, the Nazi scientist who came over following World War II, part of Operation Paperclip, along with 1,400 other German scientists and other very bright people. And it was von Braun that would put together the space program in the United States. The Soviets would score another first. Varina 1, Soviet space probe, first man-made vehicle to reach another planet. It arrives in Venus. By May 25th, Kennedy's got this goal. We're going to send men to the moon at the end of or by the end of the decade. May 25th, he's in front of Congress, and he makes the statement, the goal of sending an American safely to the moon before the end of the decade. And it would be men. In general, Kennedy felt great pressure to have the United States catch up and overtake the Soviet Union in the space race. Space race would be part of the Cold War, and America was losing. Kennedy and Khrushchev would meet together, the Soviet premier Nikita Khrushchev and JFK, and that would be in June of 1961. I'm sure you heard recently that there is a possibility that Joe Biden is going to meet with Vladimir Putin. Same situation, first-year president, meaning the old hand at the Soviet Union, or today Russia. The Soviet Union and the United States, this is supposed to happen in June, and JFK bombs out totally. Part of JFK's problem is he really didn't listen to his advisors. He decided he's going to do what he's going to do, and some of that got him into major trouble. He was kind of a reckless president. So Kennedy and Khrushchev would meet at Vienna, or in Vienna at a summit in Austria. Kennedy explained his experience with Khrushchev, such as, he savaged me. He savaged me. And Khrushchev told an interpreter, this man, Kennedy, is very inexperienced, even immature. Compared to him, Eisenhower is a man of intelligence and vision. The summit. Kennedy, his advisor said, don't get into any debates with him. Don't talk about communist ideology. Don't waste your time talking about Marxism. Kennedy didn't listen. He also spent a lot of time defending aspects of pre-World War II status, like British imperialism in Africa. Kennedy also told the premier he considered, and this is a mistake too, he considered the Sinai Soviet forces, China and the Soviet Union together, except China and the Soviet Union weren't getting along all that well in 1961. He considered Sino-Soviet forces and U.S. Western European forces to be about equal. Kennedy and Khrushchev would end the talks, but they would continue to communicate. A hotline between Moscow and Washington would eventually be installed. And both eventually came to the understanding that neither one of them wanted nuclear war. On July 25th, in a speech, Kennedy emphasizes that any attack on Berlin, of course, it has been a pawn since the end of World War II between the Soviets and the Americans. Any attack on NATO is an attack on the United States, or any attack on Berlin is an attack on NATO. In 1949, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States founded that alliance. 3 other members were added: Germany and Turkey in 1952, West Germany in 1955. But here's where it starts getting really, really scary in the United States, because 2 weeks after this meeting, the U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk tells NATO, be prepared for anything. What's anything? Bombing. Nuclear bomb? Be prepared for anything. The Berlin Wall construction begins on August 13th, 1961. As you can see, there is the beginning of the construction. Construction of the wall was commenced by the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, on August 13th, 1961. The wall cut off West Berlin from surrounding East Germany, including East Berlin. The barrier included guard towers placed along large concrete walls, accompanied by a wide area that contained anti-vehicle trenches, beds of nails, and other defenses. And here is the Berlin Wall going up. Why the wall? Why was there a wall? Well, in 1955, the Soviets decided to cut loose and tell East Germany, you're the ones in charge of civilian movement in Berlin. That was not recognized in the West, like in the United States, England, and France. Initially, East Germany granted visits to allow residents access to West Germany. However, following the defection of a large number of East Germans, the new East German state legally restricted virtually all travel to the West in 1956, and there is more of the wall being constructed. With the closing of the east-west sector boundary in Berlin, the vast majority of East Germans could no longer travel or immigrate to West Germany. Many families were split. East Berliners employed in the West were cut off from their jobs. West Berlin became an isolated enclave in a hostile land. West Berliners demonstrated against the wall, and Willy Brandt strongly criticizes Kennedy and the United States for failing to respond to the building of the wall. The wall didn't stop everybody. This guy got across and was able to escape. Meanwhile, back in New York, Times Square, Hotel Astor. Remember Bonds? Remember Bonds Clothiers? 2-trouser suit. I remember Bonds. Woolworths. Remember Woolworths? Lofts Candies. And there probably were some other things there that I don't recall, like the candy place. What was that? Backrack or something like that? Candy place over there. Anyway. This is New York testing out fallout shelters. Times Square is closed down except for the guard dog and the cop, a test against a possible nuclear bomb dropped in Manhattan. And hiding under desks. Well, I hid under a desk. I was in first grade in 1961. Mrs. Topar was my teacher. She hated me. She couldn't stand me. She wrote on my report card, Evan tries to take over the class. I was 5 years old. I was kicked out of kindergarten, thrown into first grade. They wanted to throw me out of first grade and put me in second grade. But I was only kicked out of kindergarten, hence I was a year ahead. And we had the fallout shelters, and we had the duck and cover drills that you might remember. You went like that under a desk. I couldn't figure out why I would go like this under a desk. If they're going to shoot us down, or they were going to shoot a nuclear bomb down on us, or rain a nuclear bomb down on us, why would we hide under the desks? But yeah, I had to hide under the desk reluctantly, very reluctantly. On September 15th, if you subscribed to Life magazine and got that issue on September 15th in September of 1961, hey, you got a letter from President Kennedy. Yeah, was that great? You got a letter from President Kennedy, except you probably didn't want to read it because the news wasn't good. My fellow Americans, he wrote, nuclear weapons and the possibility of nuclear war are facts of life we cannot ignore today. The fallout shelter. There are some people who probably still have fallout shelters, and you probably remember those signs all over the place, fallout shelter here. And you can probably see a few here and there, and they're all rusted out because they are 60 years old. and some of them were never taken down. The federal government would soon begin a program to improve the protection afforded to you and your communities through civil defense. The shelters were not going to protect people from exploding bombs. I knew that in first grade. But people away from the bomb might get some protection from bomb materials that were scattered for weeks after an attack. There would also be some food and other necessities available. On October 29, 1961, the USSR detonated a 50 megaton hydrogen bomb in the largest man-made explosion in history. Hey, that's a fancy fallout shelter. That's one that you put in your backyard. You dug the hole up, you threw it down in there, and that's one that you used. And I was doing this talk in Chicago for the Shamberg Senior Center 2 weeks ago. And a woman was telling me, and this woman now is probably in her 70s, that her grandfather was living in Florida. And in case you didn't know this, that in Florida there are no basements because you can't really dig because it's basically water underneath Florida. It's a swamp. It's all swampland. Except for some areas that have some rock on top of it. But anyway, she said that her grandfather kept shoveling and kept getting stuck in the mud. Look at this. They got 1, 2, 3, 4 beds, canned water, canned food, canned other stuff. You could actually survive in there for about a week. Goodbye, 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 Joe Stalin. Well, Stalin had been dead for 8 years by this point. Goodbye, Uncle Joe. But the Soviet Party unanimously approved a resolution removing Stalin's body from Lenin's tomb. Guess the roommates weren't all that comfortable together. In Red Square as part of a de-Stalinization effort. Stalin died in 1953. Well, in the United States, you probably knew somebody that ended up joining the Peace Corps. And the Peace Corps was basically put together to combat the stereotype of the ugly American or colonialism, and we're your friends. March 1st, 1961, Kennedy signs Executive Order 10924 that officially started the Peace Corps. Concerned with the growing tide of revolutionary sentiment in the Third World, all those African countries and what's going on in Southeast Asia, Kennedy saw the Peace Corps as a means of countering the stereotype of the ugly American and Yankee imperialism, especially in the emergent nations of post-colonial Africa and Asia. Kennedy's first appointee was his brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, to head up the program. The Peace Corps was born during the Cold War. It was created to win the hearts and minds in the non-aligned developing countries, particularly all those countries in Africa. 1960 was the year of African independence. 17 nations declared independence. The continent, though, after, hey, we're free, we're our own country now, began to face the realities of, well, England's not here anymore, and France is not here anymore, Portugal's not here anymore, we're on our own. In 1960, the opposition to South African apartheid and its government would start. In 1960, all of the colonies of French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa became independent. Where did the Peace Corps go first? Well, Ghana in Africa. The first group of volunteers arrived in Ghana on August 30th, 1961. By the end of the year, 500 Peace Corps volunteers were serving in 9 countries: Chile, Colombia, Ghana, India, Nigeria, the Philippines, St. Lucia, Tanzania, and Pakistan. Meanwhile, Nikita Khrushchev wasn't buying any of this. Khrushchev didn't like it at all. And he claimed that, and the Soviets claimed, the Peace Corps volunteers were really spies. Back in the USA, there is George Lincoln Rockwell, the head of the Nazi Party in the United States. And we do hate race mixing. Lincoln Rockwell's hate bus. Meanwhile, the freedom fighter, Joan Trump-Hauer, is arrested in Jackson, Mississippi. She was a 19-year-old Duke student, part-time secretary in the Washington office of Senator Claire Engel of California. She arrived in Jackson, Mississippi to take part in the June 4th Mississippi Freedom Ride. She and several others, 8 of them, were promptly arrested, refused bail, Trump served 3 months in jail, later enrolled in a traditionally black college, Tougaloo, and that college just started accepting white students. Albany, Georgia is an interesting place in the civil rights movement because eventually something good would happen there, but it took a while. The Albany movement began in November 1961. It was the first mass movement in the modern civil rights era to have as its goal the desegregation of an entire community. And it resulted in the jailing of more than 1,000 African Americans in Albany and surrounding rural counties. King was there, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He shows up in December 1961 after hundreds of black protesters were arrested. He too was arrested in 1 week. 8 months later, King left Albany. He failed, but the city didn't. They did get, and this is Georgia now, and you've heard what's been happening in Georgia over the last couple of weeks with voters' rights. In Georgia, voter registration actually increased. African-American businessman Thomas Chapman secured enough votes in the election for a city council seat to force a runoff. He wins the following spring, and Albany Commission removed all segregation statutes or laws from the books. The courts up here in Westchester, Judge Irving Kaufman orders the Board of Education in New Rochelle, New York, to integrate. That was May 31st, 1961. In Gardner against Louisiana, the court overturned the disturbing the peace convictions of 5 African Americans who engaged in sit-ins at an all-white restaurant counter in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. On September 30th, James Meredith, a student at the all-black Jackson State College, filed a lawsuit against the University of Mississippi alleging racial discrimination. The case was eventually settled on appeal by the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled in Meredith's favor in September 1962. And he would eventually go to school there in fall of '62. Now, can you believe this? This is Francisco Franco. He is the fascist dictator of Spain. And yet, he's a civil rights pioneer. How could that be? How could that be? Equal rights for women in the workplace. Still hasn't been passed in the United States. Was signed into law by Franco July 22nd, 1961. A change in the law made it easier for women to gain employment in the public sector. Women face many restrictions, including the need for their husband to approve their job before allowing them to sign employment contracts. In 1961, the law gave women in the workforce additional rights they had previously lacked by recognizing them as important in their line of work. The law entitled single women or allowed single women to get the same salary of her male peer working in the same job. Some other things that went on in 1961, the 23rd Amendment to the United States Constitution, March 29th, 1961, allowed the residents of Washington, D.C. to vote in presidential elections. That gave 3 electoral votes were up for grabs there. Washington's a federal district. It's not a territory, which means they can vote for president and vice president, but they can't vote for Congress and they can't vote for the Senate. And as you know, or may know, right now, the Senate is taking up a question of whether or not Washington, D.C. should be a city-state. And they're also taking up the question of whether Puerto Rico should be a state. Puerto Rico has about 3 million people, whereas Washington has about 700,000, which is more than states like Wyoming. On April 13th, 1961, in Portugal, a coup against Antonio de Alarive fails, or Salazar fails, and so he remains running Portugal. November 19th, 1961, a military uprising overthrows the Trujillo regime in the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic would be a problem for the United States in the first half of the 1960s. Eventually, Juan Bosch was deposed, and the United States would send troops into the Dominican Republic around 1964. And there were various wars and revolts in Africa after countries declared independence. The Middle East. The Middle East. Problems in the Middle East, and they don't involve Israel in this case. The Iraqi government threatened to invade Kuwait, and the invasion was finally averted following plans by the Arab League to form an international Arab force against Iraqi's designs on Kuwait. That's a problem that would not go away, and 3 decades later, Saddam Hussein tried to rectify the situation. Saddam was, at this point, 1961, is in exile in Egypt, but he would come back in 1963. September 28th, 1961, there's a military coup against in Damascus, and that effectively ends the United Arab Republic, which was a union between Egypt and Syria. This guy's name? Newton Minow, still alive, lives in Milwaukee. He's in his 90s now. And he is now the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. And he decides one day, well, he didn't decide, he goes in to testify before Congress one day about television. And you might remember television back in those days. New York had channel 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, 11, channel 13, which kind of ran educational programming, but would become a member of NET in 1962. And there was also channel 31 on the UHF band. And if you were lucky, depending where you lived in the New York area, you might get channel 8 out of New Haven or channel 6 out of Philadelphia. But wasn't all that much, not like today. Minow goes before Congress and gives what is called the Vast Wasteland speech. He says, television and the public interest in his speech. He says commercial television landscape is a vast wasteland, and advocated instead for public service television. He does push CBS and NBC and ABC to expand their nightly news programs from 15 minutes to a half hour. Newton would push for educational TV, and chances are back 60 years ago, you might have resembled something in that picture, the whole family gathering around the TV, the old black and white TV. I don't see rabbit ears there. That's one I don't see in that picture because they would have rabbit ears back in those days. Minow did watch TV. He wasn't impressed with what he saw. He said, you will see a procession of game shows, formula comedies about totally unbelievable families, blood and thunder, mayhem, violence, sadism, murder, Western bad man, Western good man, private eyes, gangsters, more violence in cartoons. Hey, wait a second. In 1961, I was watching the Bugs Bunny show on Sandy Becker, and I like Sandy Becker, and I loved the cartoons that he showed on Channel 5. Channel 5 had the great cartoons just for fun with Sonny Fox on Saturdays and the Sandy Becker show every day. So come on, ease up, Newton. Anyway, and endlessly commercials, many screaming, cajoling, and offending, and most of all, boredom. He was bored watching TV. Oh, true, you'll see a few things you will enjoy, but they will be very, very few. And if you think I exaggerate, I only ask you to try it. Although the period 1960 through 1965 around there was probably the golden age of television dramas. Oh, wait a minute. The captain or the skipper of Gilligan's Island's crash ship was named Minow, M-I-N-N-O-W, named after, Newton Minow. The Gilligan's Island TV boat, Gilligan's Island started filming in 1963, was actually named after Newton Minow. The Gilligan's Island executive producer and writer Sherwood Schwartz believed that Newton Minow ruined television. Some of the things that you might remember, cloth diapers. I know I was in cloth diapers. I know that for a fact. But if I was born a little later, I would have been in Pampers because Pampers started in 1961. Oh, baseball changes. There is Roger Maris, who I got to interview a couple times in the 1980s. I am a journalist. I was covering sports at that point. Here he is with Sal Durante, who caught his 61st home run ball, right field at Yankee Stadium, and Roger posing with the ball that he hit for the 61st home run, which broke Babe Ruth's record. 1961 was the first season since 1903 that there was not 16 teams. There were 18 teams. The American League approved the transfer of the Washington Senators, Cal Griffith's Washington Senators, to Minneapolis, and then to fill that gap and get a team in Southern California, they expand by 2 to Los Angeles and Washington. The American League would have the 162-game schedule, and that would cause a problem for the baseball commissioner, Ford Frick, who is a drinking buddy, apparently, of Babe Ruth, and was still friends with the Babe's widow, Claire. And basically, Ford Frick, the commissioner of baseball, said that if Maris is going to break the record, he better do it in 154 games, because that's when Babe Ruth set his home run record in 1927 during a 154-game schedule, that any home runs after that were ahead of Babe Ruth in 60, between games 155 and 162. No, that shouldn't be the record. The Babe's record should hold up. It never did. Roger Maris did hit the home run 61, and he was recognized as the one-season home run king. Oh, and Barbie got a boyfriend. Barbie got a boyfriend. There he is, Ken, complete with a yellow towel and the white, red swimming trunks. Ken, the Ken doll. Everyday life. You know what happened in 1961? You got an electric toothbrush if you wanted to buy one. Barbie Roberts gets a boyfriend. Ken and Barbie sitting in a tree. Frito corn chips appear. Cassius Clay is moving up the ladder, heavyweight boxer at this point, and he's doing rather well. So Cassius Clay, he's still a couple years away. You're not ready yet for the prime time, but he is getting there. There he is at the age of 19 in 1961. And hey, did you want to see the Beatles? Well, you could as the Beatles, as a 4-man group at this point. George Harrison, Pete Best, Paul McCartney, and John Lennon in that picture. The Cavern Club presents one show, The Beatles, February 9th through 11th. February 9th, 1961, Matthew Street in Liverpool. Both Cassius Clay and the Beatles are getting ready for 1964. The legacy from 1961, the civil rights movement continued. John Kennedy did very little in 1962 or 1963 to support the cause. The situation in Cuba would come to a head in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States would continue to support the Vietnamese and President Diem. There would be no reform to the Electoral College. You might remember a few weeks ago, people were talking about, well, maybe it's time to get rid of the Electoral College. The senator from Montana, Mike Mansfield, the Democrat majority leader, said that he felt that the Electoral College needed support because it was out of date, and that was 60 years ago, and they're still talking about it. Iraq would invade Kuwait in 1990. That would be Gulf War #1. The Americans, George H.W. Bush, wanted to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. They did so in 1990, the first Gulf War. And 1962 is around the corner. I want to thank Wendy for inviting me. And any questions, any comments? The floor is yours if you have questions or comments. Anybody have any questions? Maybe I could hear you. Anybody have any comments? Questions, comments? Well, I hope you enjoyed it. Can you hear me okay? I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you in about 2-3 weeks. I think I'm going to do the Lucy talk, how Lucille Ball became one of the most powerful business women in the United States in the 1960s, and she did it on her own, pretty much so. Anyway, Wendy, thank you for inviting me, and hope to see you live one day. Stay safe, stay well, and hope you enjoyed it. My name is Evan Weiner, and we'll see you again soon. Take care, everybody. Have a good night. Stay safe, stay healthy. We'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.